This attack happened.
Yeah. Guten Abend, good evening. Hi, Chelsea.
Hello.
Before, Chelsea, you kick off with your input talk. For roundabout, we just discussed it. You give me a sign once I may jump in. Again, yeah, feel free to send us an email. Julia forwarded the email address already. It's chelsea@theaterneumarkt.ch. I encourage you to start right away transmitting your emails, and whether it's a question that you have for you, Chelsea, or whether it's a topic that you would like us to elaborate on, for example, security versus verification, that is something we're going to discuss tonight for sure. Data in times of war, we can't miss that out. NIM, obviously, and because you're going to DJ tonight, I think music as your passion could also be something that you might be interested in. So drop us a message. Depending on the amount that you send through, we have to cut. We're already way late, so bear with us if we don't manage to get your particular question in. Hey, again, very warm welcome to you, Chelsea, to Theater Neumarkt. Chelsea E. Manning, security consultant, former Intel analyst, player of games, and I have no clue how to pronounce it. Please help me.
Vigigames, that's it.
Vigigames?
Vigigames.
Thank you. Transam,
just video games, but sped up.
We need to discuss that too. Because of course, I Googled it, but not how to actually speak it out loud.
Gotcha.
Today you work at NIM, a company based in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, as hardware optimization and security advisor. Just now you will share some insights on the paradox presented by rapid advances in technology.
Yep.
On the one hand, we have way greater access to information, connection, entertainment, innovation, thanks to the internet, than we have ever had before. It's about the raising threat, though, of authoritarian control over our daily lives via technology, such as police surveillance and rising political extremes on the other hand. So technology advances can and have been used to survey, control, anticipate, and sometimes even kill. Yet that very wild diversity of cultures, languages, lifestyle, and relationships that are often cited as some of the miraculous outcomes of our connectivity shrinking because of these same advances. We think of state surveillance, we think of surveillance capitalism, a term coined, I think, heavily by Shoshana Zuboff. Synonyms are, as we discussed yesterday, it's Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, rebranded to Meta. We think about statistical nudges and big data algorithms that create gender, racial, ethnic, gendered identity, sexual orientation, religious, political, and other biases across large swaths of the online population, intensifying polarization. We think about the heavy focus on precision targeting swing voters in the political realm. And since code is written by humans, and since hardware is built by people, biases may be hardwired into new technologies. Chelsea, you argue, as I learned, for the importance of the human element in development of technology.
I did.
And the imperative to operate with responsibility, accountability, and a strong moral compass for the sake of not only our privacy, but for the future of humanity. So, huge topics.
Great.
Hopefully an inspiration to you. You're on in 1 minute. Hopefully an inspiration for you guys.
I'm eager.
And I'm out. Over to you.
All right. Thank you. This is my first off. I'd just like to say thank you for inviting me here to Zurich. This is I think my third time here in Zurich, so not my first time in Old Town, but it's always lovely to be here. It's lovely to be here whenever it's not freezing cold as well. So there is that.
We're not Silicon Valley though.
Well, it's cold there too. Cold in physical form and in just heart, right? So anyway, the human element is sort of the focus of what I like to talk about. And what I mean by that is, I'll just take this back a little bit. Most people know who I am. It's pretty widely known, but a lot of people don't necessarily know my background, which is, even people are kind of mystified by the fact that that I was a former intelligence analyst. What does that mean? And well, I think the modern synonym for that is a data scientist. So that was really what I was in Iraq and to a lesser extent Afghanistan in my time in the military, the U.S. military. But before that, I was still doing data science. I was still doing, statistical analysis. I studied math. I studied physics. That's what I ultimately wanted to be. I wanted to be a physicist until somebody in the physics professor track told me, don't do physics because there's no money in it. And so I would argue that's a lie. Yeah. So I come from this background of being very interested in math, being very interested in problem solving, right? And I think that is the case for a lot of people in technology. Very focused on the logic, very focused on the problem, very focused on having, I used to think of having this ability to math my way out of any problem, right? Having a strictly logical framework in which to do problem solving. But one of the things that started to happen whenever I was doing this kind of work in environments and in situations like in the military, where it impacts human lives, where you're essentially trying to do predictive analysis across taking a large swath of data, and it's sort of this anonymization process and this sort of dehumanization process that machines are able to do. You're essentially trying to do as well as a participant in this process, as a developer, as a designer, because I was an intelligence analyst, but ultimately what I was doing was training machine learning algorithms to sort through data, right? Through these large amounts of data. So that's no different from like what Google or Facebook does, mm-hmm. right? Except, the consequences are on a much grander scale, I would argue. In Iraq and Afghanistan, in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the wars that were widely discussed in the 2000s and the early 2010s, we were just essentially trying to apply technological solutions to human problems, and the consequence of that was this sort of continuation of this feedback loop, and I was participating in this feedback loop, and that's one of the drivers, I think, to, people always ask me like, oh, well, what led you to the leaks of 2010, right? And it really wasn't one thing. It was this sort of process, of the fact that we are collecting a large amount of data, we're sorting through this data, and we're learning so much about people, and then realizing that there's people attached to these, database entries, that these are not, you're not mathing your way through a problem here. You're really just trying to ham-fist a logical problem to what is essentially a social and economic and justice-based problem. And in the military context, it's even more stringent because it's a life and death matter, as opposed to, like what corporations do in terms of determining whether or not you have access to credit, depending on what country you're in, whether or not you get certain ads, right, for certain things, or whether you get presented with, information that, feeds within your particular political biases, or within your particular religious, or with your religious or social or cultural background, right? So you can learn this with a very small amount of data, you can learn, because we didn't have, in 2010, we didn't have an enormous amount of data about people, but we could learn, and we could use these algorithms to really hone in and really get into the depth and in the weeds of how people in general, as groups, can interact with each other. And I think that the fact that the corporations have really, I mean, larger corporations have in many ways done more than what the state can do. You know, people think of surveillance. People think of what the U.S. military can do. People think of what U.S. and Five Eyes, UK.
Can you explain who the Five Eyes are?
Right. I was going to go down the list. So it's the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and I'm forgetting someone out.
New Zealand.
New Zealand. There we go. I always forget about New Zealand. There's actually a different standard called ACGU, which exempts New Zealand because New Zealand is forgotten about by the Five Eyes as well. The Five Eyes is essentially a surveillance pact. It is, we are all doing global surveillance as Anglophone countries. Yeah. We are collecting all of this data, and then we're sharing our data using our various apparatus, and we're essentially acting as one single intelligence unit, even though we have 5 different agencies with a number of different stakeholders. And so it's this vast sort of, intelligence collection platform, which can suck up enormous amounts of data. But, there's only so much analysis you can do as a state. There's only so many, there's a lot of rules that are imposed. There's a lot of restrictions that are imposed. Believe it or not, sure, there was the Edward Snowden revelations in 2013. But even then, it's just sort of like there are a lot of these rules and strictures in place, but they're not in place for corporations, right? There are far less in terms of like what private institutions, particularly American-based private institutions, are able to do with this data, and certainly the GDPR, has come in to sort of counteract that. But again, it is an institutional. It's an institutional and establishment sort of reaction to what is an institution reaction what is essentially an institutional and an establishment platform, right? So you're essentially trying to use the state, or in this case, the European Union, so multiple states, a pact of different states, to regulate and impose restrictions on, on large corporations and what data they collect, how much privacy you have. But I think that the limitation that we have with that is that you're really dependent upon the states to maintain those regulations, to ensure that they're not lobbied away, because there's already an effort underway to sort of dismantle the GDPR while still having the main sort of appearance of having your privacy still there, where you still get the form that you get the form that comes up and asks you about the cookies, right? That's sort of the what most people see or interact with GDPR. But you're really depending on really the institution. And my argument is that really we have a cultural problem with our data collection, right? Every second that we are interacting on our phones is data that is being collected most often, unless you're, really good and you take enormous amounts of precautions, and the cost is just, it's so high I gave up, right? So when you're dealing with when you're interacting with your electronic devices like your phone, you're really collecting. You're collecting things down to the microsecond at this point, right? When you're on TikTok in particular, I think TikTok is like the best example for this, because what TikTok does that is different than the other companies like Meta and formerly known as Facebook.
Let's stick to Facebook. I learned that yesterday from my colleague Adrienne Fichter, because I pointed out Meta, and she was like, no, you stick to Facebook.
Right. So I'm just going to use Meta as an example of, or TikTok. I'm using TikTok as an example. Sorry. So TikTok collects data at every point, at every entry point. The second that you open the app, how long you're on the app, down to the microsecond. How long you're watching a video, how long you take to pause watching a video, down to the microsecond, like down to the fractions of a second. And that's how and it learns so much about you based on just this. They're able to learn essentially who you are, what your interests are, what your politics are, how old you are, where you're from, what languages you speak, and whether you like cats or dogs, based on your interactions with the content coming through there on fractions of a second, right? So that is the amount of data, like the kinds of data that is being collected doesn't always equate to something that naturally feels like it is data that you should hold as being private, right? Yeah. Because everything, the key to predictive analysis is gathering data that has no apparent connection to your privacy and learning things about you. It's a side channel attack, if you will. Looking at it from from a security expert perspective, you're essentially, if you don't know somebody's national ID number or social security number, or if you don't know their address, or you don't know their demographic information that is normally private, you can still learn things about them through this side channel attack of collecting how long they're looking at something, how long or how many times they click like on something, how many times they log in and out of something. You can learn a tremendous amount of information from these data points. People call this metadata, but it goes further than that, because it's really not even metadata. It's like metadata. It's like data about the metadata at that point. And so what really gets lost in all of this is the human element, and it's the cultural element. And I think that the way that, people often ask me, well, how do you resist this process? And I think that we need to stop relying on institutions that have an interest in collecting this data and regulating this data from being the arbiters of what is the correct way to use information, what is the incorrect way to use information. Really, it's a cultural issue. So from a technologist perspective, I often encourage people as technologists and developers, data scientists, we have a responsibility, we have a role in how we do and how we conduct our jobs, and how much of an ethical role that we hold, right? And I use doctors and lawyers as an example, right? These are very important professions. They're highly respected professions, and they have professional standards, right? For doctors, you have the Hippocratic Oath. For lawyers, you often have a bar that you go to. You have, an organization.
A bar is an exam that you have to take to actually practice law.
Yeah, exactly. Or the association of other. You have the court system as well. You have ethical obligations in these fields, right? So as a doctor or a lawyer, you have these ethical obligations, and you're really only interacting with one person or one client at a time, right? So if you're a doctor, you do no harm to your standard for one person. But as a technologist, you working on a machine learning algorithm and siphoning in an enormous amount of data that's been collected, you're impacting the potentially very significant, not necessarily life and death as in the military, but very significant life choices, life decisions, life paths for large swaths of the population, for huge demographic chunks, and you're not held to any ethical standard. There's no board, there's no ethical board or a regulatory framework that's in place, and that's a cultural issue. Like, technologists need to do this themselves, and that includes people in California or any other hubs in the world that are bound to eventually crop up and become technology centers. Shanghai in particular, I can think of, especially with sort of the diversification of hardware with the chip shortage. We're going to see more Silicon Valleys around the world develop. But this is a critical time in history where technologists need to decide: are we held to an ethical standard, and do we hold ourselves to this standard? Do we have obligations towards the people that that are end users of the things that we build, or not? Because if we continue to design, develop, build these tools and try to math our way through these problems, then billionaires, large corporations, shareholders, the political institutions, the predominant political parties are all going to benefit from these tools that are being built without any sort of say for the average person who doesn't know anything about this stuff. And I really think that technologists have a lot more responsibility in this than just saying, oh, it's because Jeff Bezos, or it's because Zuckerberg, right? Like, to the people who are in these labs, who are in the AI labs, who are running these programs, have a responsibility to say, hey, you know what, we're not going to do this. We can withhold our services, and not doing so should be seen as a good thing. It's not that you're not working; you're actually doing your job as an ethical data scientist, as an ethical researcher, as an ethical AI. I'm going on an aside here, but like the Google AI lab or the Google AI lab,
Timnit Gebru.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They started to do this, and I found it funny how as soon as they started to actually do their job, the Google ethical AI, the folks at the the ethical AI, if you can use that phrase in Google context without laughing. But as soon as they started to do their job and they started to make recommendations and say, hey, you know what, like we should slow down on this project, they shut down the lab. They just fired everybody, right? So they're like, oh well, we didn't actually wanted to have an ethical. We just wanted to have one on paper, right? So I think that
it was heard. It's a case of a Google researcher who co-led this lab, apparently, and
a friend of mine as well.
Both of them had to leave the company.
Yes.
Right?
Oh, they weren't alone. There was multiple people. They're the two who were most publicized, right?
So we got that side of the professional.
And it's had a chilling effect on other AI labs too, because everybody knows each other. Like there's not really, and that's another thing that I think that has to be noted about technologists, that the people who design and develop these things, they all know each other, like socially. So this is a cultural issue. If you're quietly sitting there and you're going, hey, like just keeping your head down, right? Like we see you, we know you're there. And like sure, Timnit or somebody that speaks out on ethical AI stuff, will be fired and then given a platform and cause a chilling effect. But that ethical obligation exists regardless of whether it's legal, whether or not your company thinks it's okay, whether or not the lawyers, the general counsel thinks it's okay. And I think I'm a real strong advocate for people in the technology space, coming up with, different ideas and different solutions in terms of like how we ensured that there is this human element in the technology that we build, and that we held to these ethical standards, whether it be unionizing, not necessarily for workplace conditions, because it's a pretty cozy job. I don't think a lot of the people that I know in the data science field are particularly concerned whenever it comes to workplace conditions. Except for women, of course.
Nevertheless,
but
they are the Googlers that got together to unionize.
Right. So, but so it can be a union, or it can be like maybe an organization, a decentralized organization, not necessarily a DAO. Okay, like just. I don't think you can DAO that.
There. We're not going to take that.
Yeah. I don't think we're talking about that.
But coming back to the technologists as a profession. How to solve that dilemma? Is that something that you expect to be solved by law, by regulations? And if so, on what level? On a country level?
It will be solved by countries over time if we don't figure it out, right? And it will benefit them. And I think that's what we've been seeing happening, right? Is certainly the GDPR is a good example of institutional pushback, but I wouldn't depend on it, right? Because we don't know if the GDPR is going to, we don't even know if the EU is going to be around in 20 years, let alone the GDPR, right? So you're really depending on these institutions existing, or and we've seen this deterioration of sort of globalization was on the rise throughout the 1990s into the mid 2010s, and then now we're seeing this reaction to that. So a lot of these states and institutions that have been around since the Second World War, aren't necessarily. Imagine trying to explain to somebody in 2005 that Russia just, starts a land war in Eastern Europe. It seemed at that time it seemed it would have seemed unfathomable given the direction of where things are going. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't depend on institutions to do it. We need cultural solutions. We need to set cultural standards. We need to technologists need to police each other, and the public needs to police technologists and put pressure on the people who are designing and building these things. In the same way, you wouldn't go to a doctor and be like, okay, and have a doctor just sort of be like, well, I'll fix it as I go, if I break something, I'll fix it, or fix it later, right? That's the mentality that Silicon Valley has to building tools. Is that we'll build it and then we'll fix it later. You wouldn't go to a doctor with that.
Don't be evil.
Exactly.
You mentioned the users when you were talking about TikTok, and the question came in. What can I do as an individual to combat and counter this trend of invasion of privacy? So let's close the case of the profession that you're into, the technologist, but look at the individual. What do you suggest? What can we do?
It's a hard one. And I say this because, I live as an individual. I have an individual life, and I've tried to use privacy tools. I've tried to use these things that are just exhausting after a little bit of time. And certainly I use a password manager to make sure that people don't steal my stuff based on not changing or rotating my passwords. I ensure that I read the privacy statements on websites. I'm just always hesitant to make it an individual decision because even I'm lazy sometimes, and I'm just like, you know what? I'm just going to use this tool. I know I'm getting my data collected, but I want to see this TikTok video. It's going viral. I want to see it. And I want to share it. And I'm revealing a lot about my sort of private life there. That I'm scrolling at TikTok for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Not every day, but some days.
That was honest.
But yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I will say this. It's hard as an individual, and it shouldn't be. And I think that's the problem. It's that, I had a friend of mine who is trying to help people in the United States because there's sort of a patchwork quilt situation with abortion laws all of a sudden. Very unexpectedly, a lot of states are now imposing very stringent abortion restrictions. And so you have a lot of activists who don't know anything about protecting themselves from, they don't know anything about encryption. They don't know anything about using, VPNs or anonymity or any of this stuff. They're very well-meaning people, and yet all of a sudden they're expected to have the same knowledge and the same level of being able to provide protection for other people, including themselves, as a security expert with 20 to 25 years experience, right? And in some cases bleeding edge whenever it comes to dealing with the power of individual states in the United States, right? And their law enforcement agencies. And why is it that we put so much on the individual to have to make these decisions and make these choices? I can't expect somebody in Kansas who has no digital security experience to all of a sudden be able to threat model for a state actor. It's just not feasible. We need fundamentally more technological solutions as well as more cultural solutions.
Also, a question from the audience, and I think it fits, as there is still a chance to take back ownership of our data,
Right,
and use it for the good of the communities. What can we do, and how do we organize?
it's a good question, because one of the trends that I'm seeing is I'm seeing more and more data, like the TikTok microsecond thing that I'm using as an example. Yeah. I'm seeing more and more data that's being collected that doesn't seem to be something that you can protect against or be aware of, right? Because now we're getting to a point where there's been a lot of data collected, right? And they're sitting on these gigantic server farms, and they've been collected over 15, 20 years in some instances. And we've sort of reached a peak in terms of innovation as to what we can learn based on these data sets. But what technologists are starting to learn is that they can learn other things, and they can refine these things from data sources that might not make sense initially, right? Like the amount of time that somebody is looking at something. And so I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how to protect it against that. Whenever we get to a point where you are on an app and the facial recognition technology requires you to watch the ad before you're finished with the ad, it is just around the corner. And where you've been building this infrastructure for all these different things, and they seem unrelated, but it has a very clear goal, which is to not just ensure that you are watching an ad, to ensure that you are able to use this free service like Twitter or Facebook or whatever, but to get to a point where they're learning something about you and your reaction while watching an ad, right? So that's the level of privacy and protection and choice that I just don't know how to navigate or tell people about, because it's a reality that is right in front of us, and is just around the corner, maybe 3 or 4 years around the corner in terms of the technology that's available and the infrastructure that's in place. And these are not data sets that you can really do anything about. There are no laws protecting how long you're watching an ad. There's no regulatory framework for that, and it's obviously you can choose not to, but then you're essentially being asked not to participate in society. And in many instances, whenever it came to the pandemic, in particular, and states that were Western European or the United States, there was sort of this expectation that people start switching over to Zoom, right? Now with the facial recognition technology in place and the speed in which we're able to do these sorts of things, we can determine how long people are in conference calls or in digital classrooms, right?
It's measuring productivity in the workspace.
Exactly, and these tools are being developed right now. They're not rolled out yet, but they're being developed, and I don't know what to say to that. Because these are participatory things. You're essentially. I'm not arguing that people go out into the woods, in Montana or some place and just sort of be a hermit from society and rail against technology in some way. But I don't see that you can escape that if you are essentially forced into a position where in order to participate, you are essentially having your data collected down to the microsecond and your facial expressions, and I don't know how accurate these tools are going to be. I don't know whether the corporations care that they're accurate. We're in a situation where you may be. Are we going to be in a position where your productivity in an office workspace is measured on your voice and how respectful you are to your employers, or how well you portray the company in your social media posts or in your voice around places that are within earshot of your employer? So I don't know how far these tools are going to go, but it's going to places where it isn't your address, it isn't your name, it isn't your date of birth. This is much, these are things that you don't think of as being privacy, but are somehow getting to the point where it's at least being assumed to read your thoughts. it's being assumed to read your thoughts. If not, if it isn't even your thoughts, it's just assumed to be because the data says, because computer says yes. And so your corporations can these corporations and the states can make the decisions based on these.
So we talked a lot now about mega corporations. Another question, are the nation states or megacorps that you think are less evil than others? Which ones?
Some of them, I feel, are more openly evil than others.
Would you be willing to elaborate, plus name them?
I'm not going to name them because I think they're pretty open about it. I do think there are a lot of corporations that aren't necessarily household names that do very far-reaching damage. Obviously, a lot of people talk about Facebook/Meta, but Clearview is a company that is essentially a snake oil AI company. They sell BS to corporations and particularly to states and jurisdictions and cities that can't afford large, they have sort of budget restrictions and something, so they go with a lowest bidder approach for funding for these kinds of things. So they get a contract. So Clearview benefits from getting from sometimes secret contracts for going through, say, facial recognition data or data about criminals within the legal system, or potential parolees, people who are facing sort of state effects, and these are not household names. I don't think many people know that Clearview is a company that has these tools, that have social media scraping tools, et cetera. So I think that it's not just the big names. It's also the quieter corporations. Vanguard is a company that is a funder, is a major, Vanguard is essentially a large corporation that funds a lot of these projects because they own an enormous amount of real estate in the United States in particular and all over the world. But they fund a lot of these programs because they want certain jurisdictions to lean their certain way whenever it comes to fixing their thing, and they've been entering more into like sort of the stock market manipulation. I would argue stock market manipulation, maybe not legally, but into the stock market manipulation space for social media in particular, to try to get them to go into a particular direction.
Again, corporations, check.
Yeah.
Nation states.
Nation states. Obviously, the larger nation states get more of a bad name whenever it comes to surveillance and collection of data. But smaller countries and lesser known countries are willing to cut corners often. Obviously NSO Group, based out of Israel, is a company that has taken the approach of, we're going to give you specialized surveillance solutions to smaller state actors. Saudi Arabia is obviously famously associated with sort of being a client of NSO Group, in which allegedly the Saudi crown surveilled on activists and journalists using these tools. So it's the darker things happen at the edges whenever it comes to these kinds of things, is how I feel. So the less visibility something has and the fewer people who know about it, the more egregious sort of possible actions can take place, right? Think of it, I mean, this is obviously a very American sort of example, but a town sheriff is more likely to get away with doing something horrible than, say, a big city, like a New York City detective, right? It's just the edge cases, I think, are where the most danger lies.
You mentioned Clearview AI. They made news in Switzerland too.
Oh, they did?
They did.
I didn't catch that.
We'll brief you on that. That's why I think the name pretty short. Some in the
well, I don't want to get sued too, so.
They have quite well none. And as you said, they're an American facial recognition company providing software to companies. Law enforcement and Swiss law enforcement love to try it at a conference, and they shouldn't have done that because it's probably illegal. And the city of St. Gallen eventually is about to decide, or has we need to do a fact check on that, abolish facial recognition. But why I would like to come back to Clearview is mid-March we learned that through an exclusive by the news agency Reuters that Clearview AI offered their services to Ukraine and Ukraine accepted. So
yes,
it is that program or that software, their service offerings are out there now, and Clearview AI is participating.
Speaking of wars, I wanted to make the point that, because I've been watching the Ukraine, Russia, the Russo-Ukrainian war, if you will, where Russia invaded Ukraine quite baselessly, in my opinion. I will make that very clear. What I'm struck by in terms of how this affects technology is the thing that struck me immediately within the first 3 or so weeks of the war was I had more information on my laptop, at my computer, wherever I was in the world, whether it was here in Switzerland, because I was here for a portion of that. I was in Los Angeles, visiting some friends and going on a live stream in New York, where I live, and in Poland, where I was volunteering with to help out the refugees out there. What the thing that struck me immediately was that I had more information about the war in Ukraine from like the internet than I did in Iraq in 2010 about Iraq. And I thought that was what struck me immediately. I was like, oh, I know more about what's going on the front in Ukraine than I do from Telegram, and my Ukrainian is not great. I don't speak or write very well in Ukrainian, but I know a little bit of. I sort of got familiarized with a little bit of Russian, and definitely tried to catch up with my Slavic languages very, very quickly. It didn't work so well, but I went through a lot of this data, and I was just struck by how individuals with a lack of central authority on the Ukrainian front from Ukraine side, probably deliberately, it was much more decentralized. It was much more collection and post. People were literally posting photos and sharing information about the front.
Yeah, specify that when you said you had more data.
It's like important who, what, where. Who, what, where, when, why. The specific information that you're looking for when trying to make determinations as to assessing a situation in a combat theater environment, right? It usually takes, for a battle damage assessment to take place in the US military in 2010, it took between 6 and 24 hours for battle damage assessment to occur. This was happening at a speed of about 45 minutes to 2 hours, and it was happening online, where you could literally see the devastation that was happening to a column of Russian tanks, almost live, right? Where, I could be, and I was getting this from Twitter, not from a spy satellite, right? So
troop movements.
Exactly.
Mission critical data.
Mission critical data was, there is no, people often ask me about secrecy, because people associate me with sort of secrecy, and I'm just like, I'm always sort of struck by people who haven't noticed that there's been a shift, right? Older people.
Too.
What?
You shifted too.
Yeah.
From secrecy to verification.
Right, yes. I care more about verification of information now because it's far easier. We're actually awash in information. We have so many different sources of information coming from all these different places, and you can just inject misinformation and disinformation so much easier in this environment. And it's actually not even that states are trying to hide anything anymore. They're just trying to muddy the water and just share, like, we're getting to a point where if there's something that you don't like, then you make somebody denying reality go viral and become a social norm, instead of trying to deny it, right? Instead of trying to hide it, right? So things aren't hidden anymore. There isn't really secrecy anymore in an environment where you can find out about about what's going on in the front line of a combat zone, from Twitter or from TikTok or from...
Where specifically did it start for you? What was your point of contact, so to speak, on February 24th?
My point of context was when I knew how the war was going to go within 3 weeks. I was able to really know precisely how and lay out how the war was going to go within a few weeks of it starting, and I was confident enough that I even tweeted it. Right, I even said like, yep, I've seen enough. I know how this is going to go. Like I had that much information about sort of how Russia is order of battle is the phrase. What units are available, the logistics, the supply routes, everything. I knew everything within a few weeks. I knew enough to be able to make an assessment that Russia can't win in any, like there's no path to victory, so to speak.
You're sticking to that prognosis?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's like, if the victory is to get Ukraine to capitulate, there's no path to victory. If it is to ensure that Crimea and the Donbass are held and that Ukraine is unable to retake those positions, that has failed. There's no path to a strategic victory for Russia. There just isn't. I mean, there's maybe a black swan set of circumstances, but you don't make strategic decisions based on lottery tickets. You just don't. So I'm very confident in that. I was confident enough to tweet that assessment with the amount of information I was able to get, which 30 years ago, the average person would not have been able to make that assessment. Even with my own trained sort of background, being able to make that kind of assessment in the 1990s would have been impossible. I wouldn't have had enough data. I just wouldn't. So the information that was available for nation states to make assessments is now available to the common user if they so choose to seek that path.
One thing that is also commonly available is what I learned when I went to Ukraine to interview people that allegedly or self-declared defaced websites, placed fake calls and sent fake short messages to Russia. I also asked them how do you do that? What tools do you use? And it was very clear they work on their MacBooks, they store their scripts on GitHub. Right. They email using Gmail. I needed to get through a Google form to get accredited as a journalist to enter Ukraine. There is Amazon, Able, Microsoft engaged, obviously Musk, SpaceX, that sends thousands of Starlinks. We mentioned Clearview AI. How do you judge or comment on that development?
Well, it speaks to the importance of decentralization. I do think that one of the problems that we have with the cloud, so to speak,
the one cloud?
Is the cloud, because it's usually a gigantic data center that's owned by a mega corporation, right? Clouds are able to be attacked. They're able to be, theoretically, you could physically attack a data center, right? You could you could set a data center on fire and destroy its data.
Which happened in Strasbourg. It
did. That's why I'm saying, it's doable. So
you're not encouraged.
No, you're not. But what I think is important to remember is that I think that decentralization is occurring naturally. where you have people who are using MacBooks, where you have people who are using their phones, who are using these like decentralized individual level tools. They're connected, obviously, through centralized services, cloud hosting, but even that is sort of going through a slow decentralization process because of what have been called, what's the fancy word that all the tech people are using right now for it? Edge. Is it edge computing, where it's like, you know, you have your servers?
Quantum computing?
No, you're given like, you can like go to like Google and be like, hey, I want a server that you provide your services from, your Gmail type services from, but I want my server stored locally. I want my data stored locally. So this sort of edge computing situation is happening more and more. In order to ensure that, you know, speed, bandwidth, and dependency issues on sort of the global network in an uncertain world are taking place. I think that decentralization is a naturally occurring phenomenon. I know that people often worry about cloud computing services and things, but I don't think that's the future. I don't think that's going to be sustainable for the next 10, 20 years. I think that we are already starting to veer more towards decentralization, which I think is a good thing. And I don't mean decentralization as in like put it on the blockchain, just to make that distinction very clear. And what I mean by decentralization is physical decentralization, right? You now have more computing power in your pocket than you did 20 years ago. You can use that computing power as opposed to like throwing it up on the cloud, right? I mean, I'm always stunned at the fact that, you know, this is just me, maybe I'm just hitting my mid-30s and just amazed, but I'm able to edit videos, like 4K videos on my phone. Like, this is unfathomable levels of computing power at low energy in 2005. That would have been virtually impossible, right? You would have needed a farm to be able to work on a 720p video, a server farm to be able to work on a 720p video. And now here I am on an iPhone editing a 4K video in minutes and posting it on TikTok to be watched by millions, right? So I think that edge computing is where the most impact can be made from technology, and I think that is happening, it's naturally occurring, but we can't depend on it naturally occurring. I think that we still have to continue to demand it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why at NIM, you know, the company that I work with, NIM is developing a privacy-based network, much like Tor, in which you as a user have your data made private between the connection between you, a bit like Tor, but with a couple added layers and an incentive structure to ensure that people run nodes that are decentralized all over the world instead of centralized into main hubs or choke points. But one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by this, by the hardware part of this project is I want to be able to ensure that people's private communications are encrypted to a level that nobody can mess with, but we can do it at low power at the source, right? You can do it on your, you unlock the power, the immense computing power of the GPUs on your phones and iPads to be able to, ensure your security, to be able to ensure the security of everyone, and the encryption of everyone.
You might repeat yourself. Nevertheless, I would like to pick up on that question concerning hardware. Coming from the audience, you once said that real privacy on a larger scale can achieve by hardware solutions or change, if I remember correctly. Can you elaborate on this maybe?
Sure. Hardware for the long term, and we're seeing this more and more because software is sort of reaching diminishing returns of development. We've, you've already started to see. I mean, a good example of this is, have you noticed that all the websites just seem to be looking the same? There's a reason for that, right? It's the fact that we've sort of figured out, okay, this is how a website should look, right? This is how we should enter. the hamburger menu should work the same on everything. We don't need to innovate all that much anymore, right? So the same thing is sort of the same thing is happening with all software, where we've sort of really figured out the main bits of what we need and what we don't need, and what's fluff and what is useful. So this hasn't happened in hardware as much, mostly because the cost of development has been atrociously high. And there have been very few gatekeepers. TSMC, the Taiwan chip manufacturing company, they make, I think, 2/3 of the world's computer chips. All go through one company in Taiwan. If you're talking about the iPhone, all of those are TSMC made. If you're talking about Intel, those are made by Intel. IBM still has foundries in which they are able to manufacture chips. I think that the goal of hardware for a very long time was to make things faster. Let's put as many transistors onto chips as possible. But then we reached, Moore's law started to fail, right? Which was like, okay, we can't, turns out there are physical limits in the universe when it comes to entropy and quantum mechanics to how many transistors we could fit on a chip. Now it's about efficiency. One of the impressive things that's happened with me, or from my own experience, is I got an Apple Mac. I got the MacBook with the M1 chip, and I was floored for the first time in years by technology, because here was a low-power consumer device that had more computing capability than some of my desktop options, than some of my desktop computing options. And the reason why is because they went, Apple, along with a couple other companies that are trying to compete, went back to the drawing board and said, how can we make this chip, it's not how many transistors we can fit on it, it's how can we optimize these transistors. They put the GPU right next to the CPU, which is the graphical processing unit right next to the central processing unit. So essentially, you're saying all of these graphics things that I'm doing, it's not that it's computationally more intense than a gaming PC that has a gigantic GPU. It's that it's closer. So there's more efficiency between the CPU and the GPU from a hardware perspective. And so your user experience is the Apple iPhone is able to do graphics fast. It's able to do, the Mac M1 is able to do these things extremely fast. M2, same thing. It's about the efficiency of the chip. And we need to build hardware into the chip that can just as easily be, these hardware innovations can be made for encryption. There's a lot of hardware encryption out there, but it can be ensured and enshrined and made very, very explicit to where you cannot do something at a physical level. It's not a software issue then, it's a physical issue, and ensure that all of your data packets across the internet or across any type of network, any kind of future network that we have, depending on how far human civilization expands, is able to be encrypted by default and make that the default. Because one of the problems that's happened with networks in particular, and and the way that the infrastructure of our networks have worked, is that they haven't really changed all that much since the 1970s, right? So TCP/IP, that protocol hasn't really changed since the 1990s, or even earlier, from the 1980s in some instances. www, the World Wide Web, hasn't really changed at the infrastructure level since the 1990s and the 2000s. And so we need to build privacy into the infrastructure, down to the infrastructure layer. So you take your layers and you say, okay, we shouldn't be depending on software, because software breaks constantly and we're constantly changing it all the time. But let's make it lower. Let's put it lower in terms of like the stack of where it fits. put it at the hardware level and ensure that every data packet that goes through this device and through the network is done, is encrypted in this very specific manner. Because I think that we can do that. We can accomplish that.
To fade out, I would randomly choose 3 questions that we get.
Okay.
Do you think we'll manage?
Yes.
In about 10 minutes? Do we get
Let's do it.
10 minutes? Super.
I'll keep it quick. I know
Cool.
I can do this for hours.
How much time do we get on top? So, hey, do you see that fan companies will be regulated as utilities eventually? Do you see that as a good solution? And it continues, do you think that there is a competitive advantage of societies that use surveillance versus societies that don't? In terms, for example, the national GDP. If there is an advantage to surveillance, are there any incentives not to do it?
I'm already lost. So what's the first part?
I just want to say, so where do we start? And you want to do it quick.
We'll start with the first one.
I'll pick.
The utility one.
Yeah, we'll go for the utilities. So again, the fan companies, will they be regulated as utilities eventually? And do you see that as a good solution?
No, I don't see it as a good solution, but here's why. I think that it is good in the short term. I think that being regulated as a utility obviously ensures a lot more protections. The problem with that is that all of the utilities worldwide, mostly in the US, but it's been happening worldwide, have been pushing for deregulation while still being considered utilities. So I think that the trade-off in terms of being labeled as a utility and having the legal protections as an individual consumer that come with a utility comes with the problems of then you are locked in to a service which has the ability and the incentive to lobby their way out of problems. And also, I think that the other problem with utilities is that utilities are often not held liable whenever something goes wrong. Especially in the United States, and I know this. I know this from within the United States because this happens with power companies all the time. Utilities like PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, they have power failures constantly caused by fires that their own hardware caused. Right? So they're not held liable for that because they're utilities. So there's that trade-off in terms of like the utility versus non-utility as a legal framework. It can have its own problems. It can have, So I don't think that is the only solution, and I do think that phone companies and ISP and internet service providers will, in most jurisdictions, eventually be considered utilities, but by then the term utility might be so watered down that it doesn't matter.
How can we better anticipate the social impact of a new technology before the genie is out of the bottle? A quick answer, please.
I think the genie's already out of the bottle.
Is there anything to combat it, to put it back in?
I don't know. I don't think, and I want to be clear, I don't think surveillance is I don't think that surveillance is the issue anymore. And I don't think data retention is the issue anymore because we've already talked about these things. I mean, we've already, as a society, as a culture, seem to have just integrated into our lives. I think that it's the consequences of that, of our sort of head. We've let the genie out of the bottle, and here we are 20 years later, and we haven't really addressed these things at a critical threshold, at a critical level. And especially through the pandemic, people realize like, oh, well, this stuff, it sucks, but this is how society is, I guess. I do think that health is a factor, though.
Health?
I think health is a factor. And I say this I say this, I think that people are just starting to become and I think that this is one of the reasons why we're starting to see for the first time in history some declines in health in the United States in particular, because I consider the United States one of the first post-developed nations, a nation that went and developed and is starting to go on the downward side of the development curve, the bell curve. And so you're starting to see.
But in terms of what?
In terms of health, I think that technology can I think that integrating so much technology and having so much of your data available and you literally have your life force sucked from you. I think there's an actual physical phenomenon. It's an overlapping of several physical phenomena that are making people exhausted. It's literally sapping people of energy, sapping people of the will to live. And I think the United States is like a test case where it's like, how much can we suck the lives out of people, suck the life force out of people before it goes critical? And I think that is the sort of the test that is happening is within the United States in particular. Is that health, I think, is going to be the limit. It's going to be the limiting factor. It's going to be how sick do people get before society starts to fall apart.
Very last question before we...
Oh, that wasn't the last question?
No, there is one. There is one last question.
Okay.
How would you define freedom?
It's very hard. And I say that because, I've been imprisoned. I've been out of prison, and you know what? It doesn't feel as free as it freedom feels bittersweet. It's not what people think it is. And I like to think that in my head I'm free, and that's the only place that I'm free, that I'm truly free. And I don't know how long that will last, given the technology that we have. But while I have it, I cherish it. I cherish the ability to think, the ability to learn, the ability, because that was the thing that I learned in prison, is that is the one thing that they can't take from you, is that anybody can take from you yet, is sort of your ability to learn and grow and cherish life and being alive and being able to think and being able to feel and experience and thrive as a person.
Chelsea Manning, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that it? Are we good to go? Okay. Thank you.